the sound reached the town before anyone saw it. Not the rattling idle of a pickup coming off the highway, not the low hum of something ordinary passing through. This was different. It was the kind of sound that made a person stop mid-sentence, turn their head, and not quite understand why. Harker heard it from inside the garage. He was underneath a '94 Silverado at the time, elbow deep in a rusted exhaust bracket that had been fighting him for the better part of an hour, and when the sound moved through the walls of the building, he felt it before he heard it. A low, uneven throb that came up through the concrete floor and into his back. He stayed still for a moment, listening. Then he rolled out from under the truck, sat up, and wiped his face with the back of his wrist. He already knew what it was. You don't spend 11 years at an engineering desk designing drivetrain systems for one of the largest automotive manufacturers in the country and then forget the voice of a flat 12. It stays in you, somewhere between muscle memory and something older. He stood up slowly, the way a man does when his knees have spent too many winters on cold concrete, and walked to the open bay door. The car came around the bend on Alderton Road like something from a different century. Red. Not the red of a barn or a fire truck or a child's wagon. The red of something that had been made by hand, by people who understood that color could be a statement. A 1988 Ferrari Testarossa. The paint caught the morning light in a way that made it look almost liquid, and the sound it made at low speed was uneven, lurching, wrong in a way that Harker recognized immediately, as a man recognizes the limp of someone he used to know. The car pulled into the gravel lot in front of the garage and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, early 60s, wearing the kind of jacket that didn't have a visible brand, but cost more than most people in Dennisville made in a month. He looked at the garage, the hand-painted sign above the bay doors, the oil stains on the apron, the stack of tires against the outside wall. And his expression was the expression of a man who has tried everything and has now arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. His name was Whitmore Gable. Most people in Tennessee didn't know that name, but anyone who'd spent time in the automotive or real estate circles of Nashville in the past 30 years knew it well. Gable had made his first fortune in commercial property before he was 40, and his second in logistics. And somewhere along the way he had developed the particular habit of extremely wealthy men who love machines. He collected cars the way other men collected opinions, and he loved each one with a specificity and a depth that surprised people who assumed money made feeling unnecessary. The Testarossa was the one he loved most. It had belonged to his father. Harker didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was that the car was running badly, had been running badly for some time, based on the wear pattern on the rear tires, and that whoever owned it had driven it here to a two-bay garage in a town of 4,000 people. Instead of trailering it, which meant one of two things. Either they were careless with an irreplaceable machine, or they were desperate. He walked out to the lot. "You're losing fuel pressure on the right bank," Harker said, before the man had a chance to speak. "Intermittent. Probably not the pump itself. Pressure regulator, or something upstream of it." Whitmore Gable looked at him. "I've had 3 different specialists tell me 3 different things over the past 4 years," he said. "One of them charged me $40,000 and made it worse." Harker nodded slowly. He crouched down beside the car without being invited, tilted his head, and listened to the idle the way you'd listen to someone breathing in a hospital room. Carefully, without rushing, paying attention to what came between the sounds as much as the sounds themselves. "How long has it been like this?" 6 years, Gable said. "On and off for the first 2. Then it got worse. It's been sitting more than it's been running for the last 3. Has it been stored?" "Climate controlled. I'm not careless with it." Harker stood. He looked at the car for a moment longer, then looked at Gable. "You want to leave it?" Gable studied him for a long moment. He was a man who had spent a lifetime reading people across conference tables and had gotten very good at it. What he saw in Harker was not confidence exactly. It wasn't the bright, aggressive confidence of the specialists he'd hired before, the ones who quoted him figures in the first 5 minutes and shook his hand with both of theirs. What he saw was something quieter, the kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself. "What's your name?" Gable asked. "Harker. And you think you can fix it?" It wasn't quite a question. "I think I can find out what's wrong with it," Harker said. "That's different." Gable looked at the garage again. Then, back at the car. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed Harker a card with a number on it. "I'll need it for an event in 11 weeks, he said. Harker took the card and said nothing. Gable called a car service from the lot. While he waited, he stood beside the Testarossa, with his hand resting lightly on the roof, not quite touching it, the way you stand beside something you're not sure you're ready to leave. Then the town car came, and he got in, and the Ferrari stayed behind. Harker had moved to Dennisville 6 years ago, after Claire died. He hadn't planned it that way. In the months after the accident, he hadn't planned much of anything. He had simply done what needed doing, one day at a time, keeping his daughter fed and the bills paid and the grief at a distance that was manageable, which most days meant about arm's length and some days meant not manageable at all. Mira was 9 when they moved. She was 15 now, and she had her mother's habit of reading wherever there was flat surface: the kitchen table, the floor of the living room, the tailgate of the truck. She read during homework and after homework, and sometimes instead of homework, which Harker had stopped pretending to be strict about somewhere around the time she started correcting his grammar. She read in the garage, too. She had a folding chair she'd set up near the tool bench on the right side of the first bay, far enough from the lifts to be safe, close enough that she could talk to him while he worked. Most evenings after school she was there, textbooks spread across the surface of whatever flat thing was nearby, doing the reading or the problems with the comfortable distraction of the radio and the sound of tools. Sometimes she asked him questions about what he was doing. Sometimes she didn't. He liked it either way. It was Mira who noticed the Testarossa first, technically, because she'd come through the side door on a Tuesday afternoon and stood staring at it for a long moment before she said anything. "Is that a Ferrari?" "Testarossa, 88. She walked around it slowly, the way she walked around most things that interested her, methodically, like she was cataloging it. "Whose is it?" "Fella named Gable. From Nashville. What's wrong with it?" "That," Harker said, from the other side of the car, "is the question." He had spent the first 2 days doing nothing but looking and listening, not touching, not connecting the diagnostic scanner, not pulling components, not forming hypotheses. Just listening. He'd run it in the bay for 20 minutes on the first morning, standing back with his arms crossed, and then sat with the data from the car's onboard system for most of the afternoon. Then he'd run it again in the evening, with the bay door open, in the cooler air, and noted that the behavior was slightly different. That was the first useful thing he'd found. Temperature. The issue was intermittent and temperature sensitive, which explained why it had been so difficult to replicate in a controlled shop environment. The specialists who'd worked on it before, and Harker had asked Gable to send him the service records, all of them 4 years' worth, had all tested it at standard operating temperature and found nothing definitive. One had replaced the fuel injectors on the right bank. One had rebuilt the pressure regulator. One had chased an electrical gremlin through the secondary ignition system for 6 weeks and concluded, expensively, that the problem was intermittent and possibly resolved. It was not resolved. Harker read through the records on his laptop at the workbench while Mira did her algebra at the folding table. They kept fixing things that weren't broken, he said, mostly to himself. "Is that unusual?" Mira asked without looking up. "More common than you'd think. You get a complex system, expensive car, client with money. Everyone wants to find something. Hard to say I don't know yet when someone's paying you by the hour." She considered this. "So what are you doing differently?" He looked at the car. "Waiting," he said. She looked up at him over her book. "That's a strategy?" "That's the strategy." What he was waiting for was the car to tell him something the previous technicians hadn't given it time to say. The Testarossa's Flat 12 was a sophisticated engine for its era. Dry sump lubrication, twin distributors, a fuel delivery system that was elegant in design and profoundly unforgiving of any deviation from its intended parameters. Over time, the rubber components of the fuel system aged and stiffened in ways that weren't visible to the eye and didn't always register on standard pressure tests. But they changed behavior with temperature. And they changed behavior with time, meaning a cold start after a long period of sitting could reveal something that a warm engine running at steady state would mask entirely. On the 4th day, he ran it cold. 6:30 in the morning, before Mira was up, he started the car in the bay with the doors open and let it idle in the 42-degree November air monitoring fuel pressure on both banks simultaneously with gauges he'd adapted and mounted to give him a real-time comparison. 31 minutes into the cold idle, the right bank dropped. Not dramatically, not in the way that would throw a code or illuminate a warning. Just a slow, almost imperceptible decrease, barely outside the threshold of what a technician checking quickly would flag as significant. But Harker had been watching the numbers for 31 minutes, and he knew exactly what normal looked like, and this was not it. He sat back on his stool and looked at the readings for a long time. Then he made himself a cup of coffee and looked at them some more. The part that took the longest wasn't finding the problem. The part that took longest was being sure. There was a section of the fuel feed line, not the injectors, not the pump, not the regulator that the second specialist had replaced, but a braided rubber section about 9 inches long that ran along the right side of the engine and had, over the years, developed an internal wall deterioration that was invisible from the outside and from standard pressure testing because it only restricted flow measurably under a specific combination of low ambient temperature and low fuel demand. Any other condition and the line behaved normally. The braided exterior was intact. The fitting showed no seepage. There was no reason to look there if you were looking for something obvious. Harker had looked there because he'd eliminated everything else. He pulled the section on a Wednesday morning, cut it open with a razor blade at the workbench, and held it under the light. The inner wall had a ridge of hardened degradation running along a 4-inch section, subtle, almost not there. The kind of thing you'd dismiss if you were in a hurry, or if you'd already made up your mind about what you were looking for. He set it down on the bench and thought about the 4 years of service records, the $40,000. The 6 mechanics in 4 states who had each started with a theory and worked toward confirming it. He wasn't angry about it. It was just the way things went. Sometimes, when you had a problem that was patient, a problem that could wait. He sourced the replacement section through a supplier he'd worked with for years, a man named Edsel Pruitt out of Atlanta, who specialized in period-correct restoration components and who had, on 3 separate occasions, found Harker parts that no one else could locate. The piece arrived in 4 days. Harker installed it on a Sunday, replacing not just the deteriorated section but 2 adjacent fittings that he'd deemed marginal while he had the system apart. He did not rush. Mira came in at noon with 2 sandwiches and set them on the workbench and watched him work for a while. "Is it fixed?" she asked. "We'll see." "When will you know?" "When I run it." She sat in her chair and opened her book and let him work without asking more questions, because at 15 she understood that some things had to be done in their own time, and that asking when wasn't the same as making it faster. He ran it that afternoon. Cold start, doors open, both pressure gauges mounted, the same 30-minute idle he'd done before. The numbers were steady. Both banks, consistent, no deviation. He let it run to full operating temperature and drove it slowly down Alderton Road and back, and then out to the county highway and back, and when he pulled it into the bay again, the engine was running with a smoothness that he could feel in the steering column. A particular kind of mechanical contentment that a well-sorted engine has when everything inside it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment after he turned it off. The garage was quiet. He'd forgotten, a little, what it felt like. Not fixing the car, he'd fixed hundreds of cars. But fixing this one, the one that everyone else had looked at and ultimately set aside, the one that had been sitting in a climate-controlled garage in Nashville for 3 years because nobody could find the thing that was wrong with it. It was a 9-inch piece of rubber hose. It was patience. He called Whitmore Gable that evening. Gable arrived the next morning. He came alone this time, without the town car, driving a silver Escalade that he parked in the lot and walked from without the particular purposefulness of a man who expected to be impressed. He had the bearing of someone who had been disappointed before and had organized himself around not expecting otherwise. He nodded at Harker when he came into the bay. Harker walked to the Ferrari, opened the driver's door, and started it. The flat 12 came to life with that characteristic sound, the deep, layered rumble of 12 cylinders working in perfect sequence, and this time there was nothing wrong in it. No hesitation, no uneven beat, no subtle irregularity hiding beneath the surface. It was clean and smooth and exact, the way it had been designed to be, 36 years before, in a factory in Maranello by engineers who had cared enormously about exactly this. Gable stood very still. He was not a man who showed things easily. The decades of boardrooms and negotiating tables had given him a face that was controlled and deliberate, and he wore it the way some men wear good shoes, habitually, without thinking about it. But he stood still for a long time, and something moved through his expression that had nothing to do with negotiation. His father had bought this car in 1989. Whitmore had been 19. He could still remember sitting in the passenger seat the first time his father drove it, the sound of it, the feeling through the seat the way his father had laughed when he accelerated onto an empty stretch of Tennessee highway. His father had been dead for 12 years. The car had been failing for 6 of them. For 3 of those years it had done nothing but sit, and every time Whitmore walked past the garage where it was stored, he felt something he couldn't fully name. Not just loss, but a particular kind of helplessness, which was not an emotion he had ever been comfortable with. He realized he was gripping his own coat pocket. He let go. "Drive it around the lot," Harker said, "if you want." Gable looked at him. "I'll need a minute," he said, and Harker nodded and stepped back and gave him one. Because he understood, more than most people might have, what it meant to have something return that you had stopped expecting to get back. Gable got in the car. He sat there for a moment with the engine running and both hands on the wheel, not moving. Then he pulled slowly out of the bay and turned onto the lot and then onto Alderton Road, and Harker watched the red car move through the late morning light, smooth, even, right, until it turned at the bend and disappeared. He came back 15 minutes later. He got out of the car and stood beside it in the lot with his hand on the roof, not quite touching it, the same way he'd stood 6 weeks ago when he left it behind. "What was it?" he asked. Harker told him. He explained the fuel line section, the internal wall deterioration, the temperature sensitivity, the reason it only manifested under a specific set of conditions. He didn't talk down to him, and he didn't pad it out. Gable was a man who had built 2 companies from the ground up and understood engineering well enough to ask good questions. And he asked several, and Harker answered all of them. When he was done, Gable was quiet for a moment. 4 years, he said. 6 specialists. Nobody looked at the feed line. It wasn't obvious. You found it. Harker shrugged slightly. I had more time than they did, and I wasn't trying to confirm what I already thought. Gable reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. He held it out. Harker looked at it, then at Gable. "I sent you an invoice last night," Harker said. "I saw it." "That's the number." "This is a different number," Gable said. Harker took the envelope and looked inside at the check. He looked at it long enough to understand what it said, and then he folded it closed and held it back out. "I appreciate it," he said. "But the invoice is the right number. That's what the job cost." Gable studied him. "Most people don't hand money back." "Most people didn't do this because they wanted to," Harker said. "I did. That's worth something to me." There was a pause. Gable looked at the car, then back at Harker. "Take half, then," he said. "Call it what you want. Consultation, research. I don't care what you put on the receipt." Harker was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garage, the 2 bays, the hand-painted sign, the stack of tires, Mira's folding chair visible through the open bay door. "Half," he said. Gable nodded. They shook hands in the gravel lot, in the thin November light, beside the car that had been silent for 3 years and was running again, and neither of them said anything more about it. The story got around, the way things do in a town of 4,000. Not from Harker. He didn't talk about it. Not from Gable, exactly, though he mentioned it to 2 people, which in a small orbit was as good as a press release. Word moved from the auto parts store to the diner to the barber shop, acquiring details along the way. Some of them accurate, some invented, all of them in the general direction of the truth. What people said, that a man from Nashville, with more money than most small towns see in a year, had brought a car worth $250,000 to Harker Dole's garage after nobody else could fix it, and that Harker had fixed it, and that Harker had handed back most of the check. Most people shook their heads at the last part in the way that people shake their heads at things they find simultaneously foolish and admirable. The man at the parts counter, a longtime Dennisville resident named Beaumont, said it was the most Harker thing he'd ever heard. Harker didn't hear that because he was in the garage when it was said, lying under a Subaru wagon with a cracked CV boot, with the radio on, and Mira's voice coming from the direction of the folding chair, reading a passage from something out loud because she'd found it funny and wanted him to find it funny too. He listened to her read and laughed in the right place and said nothing about the Ferrari except what she already knew, which was everything. She'd been there for most of it. The cold starts, the pressure gauges, the Wednesday morning with the razor blade, and the length of hose under the shop light. She'd brought him sandwiches and asked questions and gone back to her book when the answers were complete. She had watched him, quietly, the way she watched most things that mattered to her. With a patience that surprised him sometimes, because she was 15, and patience was not always native to 15, but Mira had always been more attentive than her age suggested, and he suspected that some of that was Claire and some of it was just her. He thought about that sometimes, in the evenings after she'd gone inside, and the garage was quiet and he was putting tools away. He thought about what she saw when she watched him work, whether she'd carry any of it. Not the mechanics necessarily, though she was already asking sharper questions than he'd expected. But the other thing, the willingness to sit with not knowing, the understanding that some problems couldn't be rushed, the particular discipline of not letting what you expected to find get between you and what was actually there. It was the most useful thing he knew. He wasn't sure he'd ever said it to her directly. He figured she was picking it up anyway. That was usually how the important things traveled, not through instruction, but through proximity. Through watching someone you trusted work the problem slowly, without pretending to have the answer before the answer was ready to be found. The winter came on. Dennisville went quiet in the way of small towns in cold months, fewer cars on Alderton Road, the diner fuller at noon, the hardware store doing a steady trade in weatherproofing and furnace supplies. Harker kept the bay doors cracked even in the cold because he'd always worked better with outside air, and because Mira had once said the closed-up smell of the garage in winter gave her a headache. He kept the folding chair where it was. On a Thursday evening in December, she came through the side door with her backpack and a container of leftover chili from the previous night and set the container on the workbench and said, without looking up from finding a spoon, "I've been thinking about mechanical engineering." Harker looked up from the differential he was working on. "Have you?" "Yeah." She found the spoon. "I looked up some programs." "Okay, I'm not saying I'm doing it. I'm saying I've been thinking about it." "Okay," he said again. She set the container down and opened her backpack and took out her notebook and found the page she wanted and looked at whatever was written there for a moment. "You know what I like about how you fixed that car," she said. "Tell me." "Everyone else decided what was wrong and then looked for evidence. You didn't know what was wrong and you just looked until you knew." He set down the tool he was holding and looked at her. She was still looking at her notebook, one finger on the page. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing." She nodded. Like this confirmed something she'd already worked out, and then she opened her textbook and began her homework, and he picked up his tool and went back to the differential, and the radio played something low, and the heater ticked against the wall, and outside Dennisville was dark and cold and ordinary, and in the garage the light was good, and the work was there, and his daughter was reading nearby, and that was, Harker Dole had long since come to understand, exactly enough.